Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain. This is the second in a two-part series about preemptive punishment. We saw last time that the concept of nidon al shem sofo that is used regarding the Baba Machteret and the Ben Sorer Moreh, in other words, punishing someone with a punishment that seems to be greater than the crime because we think that the crime is going to lead to something much worse. In the case of the Ben Sorer Moreh, even though the child has just eaten a certain amount of basar and drank a certain amount of wine from their parents. In the case of the Baba Machteret, even though they're quote unquote only committing an act of thievery, nonetheless, they are open to corporal punishment and specifically capital punishment because we foresee something worse happening. We talked about how nidon al shem sofo is a very dangerous principle if we're going to use it in an expansive way, and B, an interesting principle in that sometimes you actually want to use it in an expansive way, such as in a case of a man cheating on his wife and us being able to say, well, eventually he won't be able to support her, so we're going to force him to divorce her now if she wants the divorce. So it was interesting to see how, on the one hand, we are very wary of this principle, and in fact, Chazal themselves take great pains to limit its use, and at the same time, the way it has shown up in just tshuva literature, right? The way it's shown up in real questions has been kind of mixed in terms of the moral concerns and the moral outcomes. Today, what we're going to talk about is Rodef. Now, I know that Rodef shows up on Sanhedrin Ayin Gimel. It also shows up again in Sanhedrin Pei Bet Amud Aleph. And what we want to talk about when we talk about Rodef is it's a little bit less preemptive in the sense of what this person has done right now is only X, and we're worried that they're going to end up doing X, Y, Z, add letters to the alphabet. It's actually, they're in the middle. They're like on their way to doing it, right? So the classic example of what we say, מצילין אותן בנפשן, right? The Mishnah on Ayin Gimel, that the people who we are willing to save with their own lives, meaning we kill them before they commit the crime, is that rodef, a person who is actively running after somebody else to kill them. So when we talk about rodef in terms of where it fits in Halakha, I would say there are probably three different places where it fits in Halakha. One is the unfortunate, very sad circumstance of an abortion. And in that situation, we do talk about the fact that abortions are permitted in halakha under certain circumstances, specifically where the mother's life is being endangered, right? The mother is the near defect. Now, we're not going to talk about that today. I think that deserves a sheer on its own, and hopefully at some point we will get to that. But for today, I actually want to talk about two other exemplars of this Rode phenomenon. One is the concept of a Moser, somebody who is essentially informing on the Jewish people. So it means that they're speaking to the non-Jewish authorities, and specifically in a context, I'm going to go with those poskim who say that Mesirah does not apply in a democracy, right, where Jews are not being unfairly targeted, but there's actually democratic principles. But in a place where Jews could be unfairly targeted by government or by individual non-Jews, Mesirah is a serious problem. Telling a non-Jew something that is incriminating about a Jew, even telling a non-Jew where a Jew's possessions are, right, in order to endanger them. That the Mesirah question is, or the Mesirah issue, is a place where Rodef comes up, and we're going to see an example of it today in medieval Spain, interestingly enough, where they actually want to put the Moser to death, midin Rodef. And then the third place where it comes up is sadly in our own time. In 1995, the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, the assassination of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the explanation given by Yigal Amir, by the assassin, was that he viewed Rabin as a rodef, and Rabin thus had to be removed from the equation before he could do more bad. Now, I think this last one is particularly important these days because I think we are in a moment where there is a lot of political unrest. And just to remind ourselves of the problematics of that argument, I just think it's important just to anchor ourselves a little bit. Okay, so let's get into the sources. I want to look first at the Masira example. I'm going to share my screen. And this is a tshuva from the Rush. Okay. So the question is asked to Rabbeinu Asher. Sorry, I just went down a little too far. Question is asked to Rabbeinu Asher, Yelamdenu Rabbeinu, teach us, our master, ma la'asot be'ish asher nitparsem alav shehu malshin liyechidim miYisrael v'lakahal la'anasin. Right? What should we do about a person who it's widely known that this person informs on individuals and communities in Israel, la'anasin, to people who have the possibility of forcing Jews, meaning taking their money, punishing them. V'hu magzim b'chol yom tamid, and it's really every day. He's exaggerating. Sheyelech v'yomar la'anasin. He goes to these people who are like oppressors. Al anashim yechidim ukilot misrael. He goes talks about individuals and communities. Dvarim sheyuchal lagia lahem machmatam nezek begufam o b'mamonam. That's something that could emerge from that real harm to their bodies or to their money, their possessions. V'hakahal mityarin me'a'ish hazeh ad me'od. People are very afraid of this man. Shehu nitzav al mishmarto kol halelot b'chatzer echad migdolei ba'alei hayecholat me'ishmaelim. This guy actually has serious connections. He works in the courtyard. He is a night guard in the courtyard of a powerful Muslim nobleman. We are very worried about this guy and who he's going to talk to and what he's going to say. So what's the shaila? V'hinei nitan lahem liYisrael rishut mitzad hamalchut b'seiter. There was secret permission given from the monarchy, ladunoto, to actually give this person a Beit Din court case, to prosecute him in Beit Din. Ve'im yimatzei min hadin shechayav mita, and if it is found that based on Jewish law, this person is liable to the death penalty, sheyamitu, they can put him to death. Ve'al ze nitkabtzu rashei hakahal, and the heads of our community have gotten together about this question. Ve'amidu Beit Din lachkor, and they at lachkor hadavar, excuse me, and they actually did get together at Beit Din to examine this issue. Im yitamet hapirsum haniskar, if it's really true that which people are saying about him that seems to be widely known, sheikablu ha'eduyot, they're going to get official testimony. V'al piem yadunu, and based on those testimonies, that's how they're going to judge this man. Mashir elahem mikav hayosher, what seems to be to them the right thing to do. And in the end, there actually is edut v'hinei yatzu livnehem eduyot. There's actual testimony. Shezeh nuscham, this is the language of the testimony. Heidu Reuven v'Shimon b'fnei Beit Din shenitbarer lahem sha'isha hazeh hu muchzak shu malshin u'masur v'shehu gazam b'malshin u'sheker le'yudim pamim rabot. Right? So it says there's actual aids that says we know, Reuven and Shimon testified, we know that this man has been informing on the Jewish people, sheme'ayom chodesh vadhena, that even since a month, bihiyot Don Pedro kan beishvilia, since Don Pedro has gotten to Seville, must be some important character, important dmut. It's interesting because I looked up Don Pedro, I think was the king in the 14th century, but I don't think he was born until after the Rush died. So I'm not sure which Don Pedro we're talking about, but clearly there's somebody here who we're worried about. Right? And when he started doing things like this, when Don Pedro was here in Seville, right? Somebody, an important person from our community went to this moser, went to this informer and said, stop doing this. You got to stop this. He didn't want to stop. In other words, he was warned, right? So we have edut that he did this and that he was warned and he still wouldn't stop, right? And then there's more and more and more. And the question is, can we put this person to death? Because essentially, we're looking at them, im yesh leduno gedin rodef. Can we look at this guy as a rodef, as a pursuer? After all, he's going to tell Don Pedro all these terrible things about the Jews, and he's going to endanger them. Now, parenthetically, I want to say the language that's used in the Mishnah about the rodef is, these are the people shematzilin otán b'nafshan. Matzilin otán b'nafshan actually makes it sound like, who are we trying to save? Not the nirdafim, not the people who are being chased, but the rodef themselves, right? We're trying to save them from their sin. And that is, in fact, what one of my favorite, I think, one of my favorite modern commentaries on the Mishnah, Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which is the Safrai family, Safrai's family's commentary. That's what they say. Matzilin otán b'nafshan actually means that you are trying to save the rodef. But I want you to notice that in the materials that we're going to see, it actually, the focus is much more on saving the nirdaf than sort of the righteous indignation of we must save the rodef before they do something terrible, right? So let's see. Now, of course, the question also comes because we know that there's a Gemara in Bava Kama, Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, where a moser can be put to death, right? So we're putting Masira and Radifa together. Okay, so let's see what his answer is. His answer here is Gam ki batlu daled mitot beitin, miyom shegalu Sanhedrin, even though we no longer give the 4 capital punishments that we've been learning about in our Masechet from the time that the Sanhedrin was exiled. Hainu davka she'ein ladun et ha'adam l'chayvo mita al achad me'aveirot shechayavin alehem mita. That means we're not allowed to put to death somebody for having committed one of the capital crimes. To kevan she'ein Sanhedrin b'mkomam, because the Sanhedrin is not in its place, ein adam shalit ladun et chaviro lemita. We are not allowed to adjudicate someone, sentence them to death for a sin that they have done. Aval elu dekachashiv b'Sanhedrin b'perek sur ben sur more, but this list that's in Perek Ben Surah Umore, Shematzilin Otan B'nafshan, that we are allowed to save them before they sin by killing them. She'ein Neharagin L'Shavar, they are not being punished for something they already did, like usual capital punishment. Ela Shalehaba, we are killing them because of something they're going to do. Latzil et hanirdaf mimavet o mipigaim, to save the one who is being chased from death or from danger. Otam lo bitlu. Those things are not null and void. You can still enact the din of rodef. That is not based on edut, elaboriyat kol adam, shirot ro'eotam. It's based on, you see them, right? Remember, our Gemara this week on Pei Bet Amud Aleph talks about how if Pinchas had gotten up in the middle of what Cosby and Zimri were doing, and it turns out that Zimri actually turns around, leaves what he's doing, and Pinchas is still attacking Zimri for the act, but Zimri is done. Zimri would be allowed to kill Pinchas because Pinchas is a rodef, right? This is not about edut, this is not about beitin, none of that. And so what the Rush tries to do is the Rush essentially goes through and says, there are several ways you might be able to do this. One way you might be able to ask a non-Jew to do this. One way you might be able to do something more passive, put the guy in a pit and don't let him out. But the point is, he does seem to allow putting a rodef to death, even in a time where the Sanhedrin is not around. That is really intense, and there is what to learn about the very real fear that Misirut caused for the Jewish people. And I think we know that even in America, there are communities that still do not inform on their criminals, which is highly, 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 highly problematic in a democracy. And there is a whole tshuva literature from the 19th century, from the 20th century, really, about how Moser should not apply in America for important reasons. But certainly here you can see why they were quite intense about it. And there are people who have written about the use of the death penalty in one form or another in medieval Spain among Jews. Separate footnote for people who are interested in going down that rabbit hole. Okay. Second example I want to give here is I want to talk about the Rabin assassination. I want to talk about the Rabin assassination because especially with a precedent like the rush about Masira and endangering Jews, et cetera, you could see how somebody might use the concept of Rodef even in the 20th century and in matters of statecraft. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to look at how poskim in those times, like really in the 1990s, how they dealt with the danger of that and the aftermath of that. How do they explain why this should not apply? Why the concept of Rodef was not something that could apply to Rabin, was not something that would allow a Jew to assassinate Rabin. So the first one that I want to show you that I find rather fascinating is actually I'd never known this before. Rav Herzl Henkin in March of 1995, we're talking, what, 8 months before Rabin was assassinated, he seems to have either written a letter or perhaps spoken orally. I'm not sure what the origins of this are, but it's in his book of Tshuvot, it's in his book of responsa literature, talking about the question of Hamadat Chevrei Memshala Lidin, right? Essentially prosecuting members of a government, right? Now, what do we mean by prosecuting members of a government? Well, where he's going to go is, are you allowed to follow the consequences of the din of Rodef for people who are doing statecraft, right? It's like presaging the Rabin assassination in like a blood-curdling way. It's fascinating. So he starts with how much he despises the Rabin administration, right? Remember, we have to put this in context of people are very wary of the Oslo Accords, especially in the religious Zionist community, which, by the way, I think is fascinating because as a kid, I was in Yavne Academy and we all got together to watch that handshake on the lawn between, that begrudging handshake between Rabin and Arafat, brokered by Clinton. And in Israel, Dati Leumi Jews were up in arms about it. So that also tells you something about how religious Zionism and modern Orthodoxy, there's something lost in translation over the Atlantic, which is really interesting to think about on its own. So it says, Ashrei hanivdal me'hamemshala ra'azot umigorala. Praiseworthy is whoever, separates themselves from this terrible, this wicked government and from its fate. U'mitzvah l'salek ota kechol shenitan, right? And it's a mitzvah to get rid of it, but lefi hukei hamedina, based on the rules of the state. Ulahachlifa bereuta hatova mimenu, right? To, right, we're about to read the Megillah, to substitute it with a better version, right? Ve'ulam, and here's my question though. Ha'im ladun et chevrei memshala b'yedei adam, right? He says, and the question of should we not just change the government, but should we judge, should we prosecute? And I think he means even in a beit-din kind of way. Should we prosecute members of the government? He says, I don't think so, right? And the reason why he says it is because he compares a memshalat Israel, current government of Israel, he compares it to a melech. He compares it to a king, a monarch. And what is a monarch allowed to do? that endangers the lives of people, and they can do it with impunity, a monarch is allowed to start a milchemet reshut. A monarch is allowed to start a discretionary war, which means that the monarch is risking people's lives for something discretionary, right? And so think in your minds, if you can't prosecute them for that, you probably can never call them a rodef either, right? And you can never actually say, well, you're unnecessarily endangering lives if they're doing that through statecraft, right? כי מלך מוציא למלחמת הרשות כדי להרחיב גבול ישראל ולהרבות בגדולתו בשמעו. Okay? Says Ad Kan Lashon HaRambam. Because a king can take people out to a discretionary war in order to expand the borders and even in order to give more prestige to his own name, etc., etc. Okay, so he goes on, he talks more, but I actually want to skip to where he talks about Rodef specifically. Well, in Yan Rodef, he says, Zekashur Bekodem. It's connected to what I said before. Ki im yesh lememshala samchut, if you say that the government has the authority of a Jewish king, lo shayach laduna ki rodef, o moser. You can't treat it as a pursuer or as an informer. Right? כשם שהעובדים בהונגריה והחיילים שהמלך מסכן במלחמת הרשות אינם יכולים לדונו. The same way, those who are sent to war by the king can't prosecute the king for putting their lives in danger. Okay? So that's basically what he says. And then he goes on to say something like legitimately bone-chilling, which is he basically realizes, look, I'm going to tell you you're not allowed to judge this. You're not allowed to judge Rabin as a rodef. But I know that some of you are going to say, well, why don't we just do an avera lishma? Meaning chas v'shalom, why don't we assassinate him even if you're not allowed to do it? Because gedola avera lishma, mitzvah shelo lishma. Better to do an avera for the right reasons than a mitzvah for the wrong reasons. So he says, v'l'she'ila shalosh altem. And on the question that you didn't ask, ha'im yesh la'avor avera chamura kedei la'atil et Yisrael? Umishum gedola avera lishma, mitzvah shelo lishma. Should we transgress a very serious transgression in order to save the Jewish people, essentially save the Jewish people from the Oslo process, right? So he says, I'm going to go with this. Eina mitziyut kain, nope. Ve'ota avera, such a sin, lo tiyah hatzala ela nekama ba'alma. That will not save anybody. It will only be revenge. V'tisaken et harabim. And it will endanger the masses. Okay? Wow. 8 months before the Rabin assassination, right? So again, if the focus of this is to actually try to change something, if you think you're going to change anything by killing the architect of the Accords, you have another thing coming. It's just not true. So first of all, it's not halachically rodef because a memshala has a din of a melech, and a melech can send people to their deaths, can endanger lives. So even if you think the Oslo Accord endangers lives, you still can't call them a rodef, and you shouldn't do the avera anyway because it won't actually accomplish anything. Now, Dr. Eliav Shachetman wrote a piece a few years later. Right? This is a little bit different. Wrote a piece a few years later, and I think he adds some interesting things here. There are two really interesting things that he adds to the concept of, well, think about the memshala as a melech, and also the concept of this isn't actually going to save anybody. Okay. And by the way, he says this isn't actually going to save anybody, and the idea of killing a rodef is if you're going to save somebody, but you're not going to actually save anybody. So even the din of rodef doesn't apply here. But he adds two other things. One is he says, I don't see anywhere in Tanakh, I don't see anywhere in Chazal where we talk about a melech or forget that, we talk about a Jewish leader as a rodef for engaging in statecraft. Even with all the Malchei Yisrael, right, the non-Davidic kings, that Chazal think very lowly of. They never call them a rodef, right? He says that absence is really significant. I don't want to miss noticing that absence. So before we even come up with the idea of, oh, well, the government is like a king and a king can send people to their deaths and a Mohammed Rashud, and because they can do that and they're not considered a rodef, then other things they do is not considered redifa or redifa. He says, no, start even before that. We never call a Jewish leader a rodef for doing statecraft. Not in Tanakh, not in Chazal, right? Kind of remarkable. A second thing he says is he says, for the din of rodef to apply, there actually has to be clear and present danger. And it's fascinating because in a footnote in that article in Tchumen, which, people can find, and if you have trouble and you want to find it, email me. I'm happy to send it to you. There's a pasuk in Shmuel Aleph that describes, remember when David had the opportunity to kill Shaul? Remember, Shaul is at the mouth of the cave, and David's in the cave, and David really has an opportunity to kill Shaul, but he decides not to, right? So it says, you see for yourself, Shaul, right? God gave you into my hands today in that cave. And I was thinking about killing you. Vatachas alecha, right? Okay, and instead I showed you pity. Va'omar lo eshlach yadi ba'adoni ki Mashiach Hashem hu. I'm not going to kill him because he is the anointed of God. Makes it sound like I could have killed you, but then I decided not to kill you. And the Radak Rav David Kimchi says, right, medieval Bible commentator, Vatachas alecha, nafshi oeni, right? Because Vatachas should have said Va'achas, I had pity, but Vatachas, she had pity, meaning my nefesh, my soul had pity, or my eye had pity. Virazal Pirshu, right? And Chazal explained, tzniut shaita b'chachas alecha. Your tzniut actually is what covered you. Not I had pity on you, but it actually covered you, meaning it saved you, right? But the point here is, ki mutar hayala horgecha, I actually could have killed you legally, ki rodefata, because you are a rodef, a pursuer. V'habalo hargecha, hashkem lahargo. And somebody who's coming to kill you kill them first. Now notice, Shachidman says, I told you that we never find in Tanakh or Chazal a melech or a Jewish manhig being called a rodef for doing midiniyut, for doing statecraft. But here, the Radak is comfortable calling Shaul a rodef, not because of Shaul's statecraft, but because he literally is coming to kill David, right? So it is possible that just like a private individual, if a Jewish manhig is going around, God forbid, and just murdering people willy-nilly, they would be considered a rodef. But that's not about their statecraft, because statecraft, he says, first of all, is never known that way in Tanakh and Chazal. Second of all, like a melech, the same way that Rav Henkin said. And third of all, not clear and present danger. Oslo is not clear and present danger. So all that I think is interesting and important to think about. I will say I want to end with the sicha that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein gave 9 days after the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. And I think there are two things that I found significant about the sicha. One is Rodef is really not the focus of the sicha. And I think that's significant to consider right after something like that happens. The idea that you would say, we're going to put the Halakha category front and center and argue why it is that you shouldn't be allowed to do this midin rodef, it feels like it's a little bit missing in the moment. Because what Rav Lichtenstein does do, and this is the second point, is he says, I actually want to understand where this perversion came from. And we have to take responsibility. That's our major moment as a religious Zionist community. We have to take responsibility for the fact that somebody grew up in our institutions and was not aberrant, but was actually a mainstream member of our institutions. And they picked up this concept from us. And we need to be aware of that. And we need to think about that going forward. It's not just, I need to prove what he did was wrong. It's, I actually need to think about the environment in which he was nurtured, and maybe there are systemic concerns that we have not been listening to or thinking enough about in terms of our chinuch of people. So he says, here was a man who grew up in the best of our institutions. A day before the murder, he could have been cited as a shining example of success and achievement and a source of communal pride. Can we honestly say that what the murderer did was despite his education, in the same way that some yeshiva graduates are no longer Shabbat observers? In that case, it's clear that the choice is despite the education. Is not here the choice at least partly not despite, but because of the education? And that I think is incredibly powerful for somebody who headed an educational institution in the religious Zionist community to say. It says instead of dealing with the argument, let's deal with the environment and ask ourselves if Yigal Amir's perspective was easily nurtured in that kind of environment. And I would say the same for us human beings living today in a time of political unrest. Where are the places where, like a perverse sense of violence is able to grow because the environment, the way we talk, the things we say, um, the lack of red lines, um, actually allows for those things. And I think it's worth thinking about these things before something happens that makes it feel like it's too late, right? And I don't know what that something is, but it's worth thinking about. And I will say, I also want to say I don't think that it's just political unrest. I think it's also, we might say, ever since COVID, the way that human beings interact with each other is a little bit broken. Um, and how do we nurture an environment where we're not pushing in the direction of um, just like taking things into your own hands in that kind of violent and dangerous way. Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to learning together next time.